So we had a good question in class about how to use secondary sources, and I'm going to show you how to use secondary sources today based on this short story by Joanna Russ called When It Changed. So the first thing I want you to do is to read the 7 pages. All right, so go through, read those 7 pages, and come up with your own ideas of what you think the story is about. Then what I would generally do, I would go to Wikipedia because sometimes when you're reading Wikipedia, you can get a better understanding of when the text was written, for instance, and maybe who the author was if you didn't know. But I think it's also important because you can go through and read a little bit more about the author, when they were born and where they were born is going to give us the social historical context we need to really understand the story. So she is classified as a radical feminist. And we might say, okay, well, what is a radical feminist? What are their goals? Maybe some of those goals are reflected in her work. And so I would go through and I would just read the synopsis of what a radical feminist is. And maybe if there's any other terms I'm unfamiliar with, I would kind of hover over to get a better understanding. So it calls for radical feminism's perspective within feminism that calls for a radical reordering society in which male supremacy is eliminated in all social and economic contexts, while recognizing women's experience are also affected by other social divisions such as race, class, and sexual orientation. Okay. Radical feminists view society as a fundamentally a patriarchy in which men dominate and oppress women. Okay. So then maybe a science fiction text would want to examine what a society looked like where you didn't have men, and that's clearly what her text is about. Assuming that you've read the text first before we get here, radical feminists seek to abolish the patriarchy as one front in a struggle to liberate everyone from an unjust society by challenging existing social norms and institutions. Okay, that's clearly what the text is about. So we can see already that this text is really a way to kind of explore what would a society look like if we were to adhere to these radical feminist ideas. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit more. The struggle includes opposing sexual objectification, okay, of women, raising public awareness, such as issues of rape, violence against women, challenging the concept of gender roles. Again, that's clearly what this text is about. We saw lots of switching of gender roles and challenging what radical feminists see as a racialized and gendered capitalism that characterizes the United States and many other countries. All right, the end goal of feminist revolution must be like that the first movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but the sex distinction itself. Okay, so they're trying to get rid of the complete sex distinction. That's clearly what happened here. All right, I'm going to keep just kind of skim reading. While radical feminists believe that differences in genitalia and secondary sex character should not matter culturally or politically, they also maintain that women's special role in production should be recognized in a comedy without penalty. That's again what's happened in this society. So we can see, and you can make a really good argument that this text is really just trying to explore what a society would look like if it were to adhere to these feminist ideas. And in some ways, it's kind of described as a utopia. So maybe that's what this person is suggesting. There, that's one idea we could possibly use just by reading up on the person's life, okay, and what her views were. I would go back to the text, and sometimes you can reread the synopsis if it's been a while since you read the story. You can kind of read the reception. Themes you have to be really cautious of because sometimes they give away ideas that you want to use and you don't want to get caught for plagiarizing. So you have to be very confident you're going to go through and read those ideas that you're going to be able to come up with your own ideas. We're going to read it for now, see what comes up. So she says, that she wrote it as to challenge the ideas in science fiction that had not yet at the time been addressed. These ideas related to the way women in society is consistently were handled by writers who are male. Okay, so she had a problem with the way that men portrayed women in stories. I have read SF. This is her quote from her science fiction stories about a manless world before. They are either full of busty girls or wuss chiffon, who slink about withering with lust. Okay, so clearly she didn't like the way that male writers had portrayed women, and so she wanted to portray a very different perspective. Again, this is a whole nother idea you could use about the text just based on this quotation here. You can get a strong argument out of that. Or they set up a static be-like society, an imitation of some presumed primitive matriarchy. Okay, considering they're living in a really advanced society, she's also challenging this idea that it would be primitive. Uh, these stories are written by men. Why women who have been alone for generations instantly turn their sexual desires towards persons whom they have only intellectual knowledge, or why female people are presumed to have an innate preference for Byzantine virginity, I don't know. Again, so that is another challenge to contemporary stories that men have written. Now, what I might think is, oh, I wonder if I can find an example of a text that she's referring to where they were, for instance, turning their sexual desires to people they only had intellectual knowledge of. And I might write a good compare and contrast paper. Okay, I'll keep reading. Uh, Russ also mentions Ursula Le Guin's novel, The Left Hand of Darkness, as an influence. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. If it inspired the story, maybe I should go and actually read what the story is about. And I would actually go and I would do that. Uh, so, sorry, I'm trying to get to the top here. It's not working. There we go. And so I'd go through and I'd read Left Hand of Darkness. I would read, the background, the setting, the plot summary, just to give an idea of what's happening. I wouldn't actually read the story itself. I would just read what was on Wikipedia. And I like to read the receptions and the themes because usually I can make connections between the themes in one story, and I can relate those themes and ideas to that person's story. And so that way, if you research one story and you look at the analysis of it, you can apply that analysis similarly to the text that you're actually studying, and that's okay. That's not plagiarism at that point. I would look at the reception, and usually the beginnings about how great the story was. I usually like to read why someone has been critical of the story. The left hand has been a focus of literary critique. Friend's work. Okay. The novel is the center of a feminist debate. The novel was the center of a feminist debate in 1969. That's interesting. And I know that the writer, Joanna, was alive at this time, so I wonder if she's part of the debate. I'm going to read what the debate was about. They objected to the use of pronouns in a society that had no men or women. Okay. There was also criticism directed at the portrayal of these characters for taking on masculine roles. All right, I would continue reading this, but the first thing I'm wondering is, since Joanna Russ was alive at this time, I'm wondering if she was also critical of the work. And so I've gone to Google and I put that in, and something has popped up. So I'm just going to open the page. I can't find an author's name here. I'd have to do a little bit more research perhaps to find it, but I'm going to look and just giving it a once over. It looks like it's academic, the fact that they're citing their sources. So it looks like it might be authentic and genuine academic work, not just some random blog post. So prevailing criticism in The Left Hand of Darkness is the alleged masculinity of her society. Okay, so there's a good critique. They said it was too masculine for a society that's supposed to be feminist. Okay, for most of these critics, is Joanna Russ really rails against the absence of domestic representation. If they were truly androgynous, would they not portray more feminine traits of minding the home and cultivating intimate relationships? She states the family structure is not fully explained and child rearing is left completely dark, something she sees as hypocritical. Okay, great. There's a super strong idea now. I can say that Joanna Russ's When It Changed is a direct challenge to the criticisms she had in The Left Hand of Darkness, because I know in When It Changed, they really did explore the idea of domestic representation. And she really did challenge even more so the idea of gender in her text, right? What does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be feminine? So now I can argue that was the goal of her paper, and she was trying to challenge these ideas. There is a great way to write a paper by using all these secondary sources, but there was a lot of different steps you saw we had to do in order to get there. I might also try to combine in the idea of radical feminism, and then I have a really strong paper. Where did she say this? I'm going to use this person's sources. It came from The Image of Women in Science Fiction, The Country I've Never Seen. I might go back and actually try to read that to see if there were more ideas, right? And that would be my idea that I would use for my paper. So that's one way you can go about and use secondary sources to help you strengthen your ideas.